In the heart of ancient Jerusalem, towering above the city like a divine landmark, stood the temple, magnificent, sacred, and awe-inspiring. It wasn't just a place of worship. It was the spiritual heartbeat of the entire nation of Israel. Crowds came here to offer sacrifices, to pray, to encounter something beyond the noise and struggles of everyday life. But on one particular day, one young man was about to have an encounter that would not only alter his life forever, but shape the spiritual destiny of generations to come. His name was Isaiah, a young man from noble roots. Maybe he came from a family of scribes or priests. Maybe he had grown up hearing stories of Abraham, of Moses, of David. But none of those stories could have prepared him for what happened that day. He walked into the sanctuary, probably expecting incense chants, maybe the soft murmur of prayers bouncing off golden walls. But instead, Isaiah was drawn into something completely otherworldly, because suddenly it happened. The atmosphere shifted. Reality itself bent around him. The veil between heaven and earth lifted. And what Isaiah saw wasn't a dream or a vision. In the usual sense, it was a full-on immersive encounter with divine glory. At the center of it all, a throne. But not just any throne. This one soared high, exalted above all else, radiating a brilliance that defied words. The Lord, the Eternal One, sat there. His presence filled the temple with an overwhelming light so intense, Isaiah could barely keep his eyes open. And around the throne, creatures beyond imagination, seraphim. Majestic celestial beings with 6 wings each. With 2 wings, they covered their faces, shielding their eyes from God's glory. With 2, they covered their feet in humility. And with the last 2, they flew suspended in perfect reverence. And they were singing not softly, not solemnly, but with a power that shook the foundation stones beneath Isaiah's feet. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. The place trembled. Smoke filled the temple. Not the kind that stings your eyes, but the kind that tells you something sacred is happening. The kind of smoke that signals God is here. And Isaiah, he was undone. Standing in the presence of pure holiness, he suddenly saw himself for what he really was, not noble, not righteous, not even clean. Just a man. Flawed, fragile, unworthy. Woe is me, he cried out, I am ruined. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. And my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. That moment right there, that was the turning point. Because before anything else could happen, before Isaiah could become a prophet, before he could speak a single word for God, he had to be honest. And he had to be purified. And that's when one of the seraphim flew toward him, not with a weapon, not with judgment, but with something from the altar, a burning coal. Now, if you're imagining pain or punishment, think again. This coal wasn't meant to hurt. It was a symbol. The seraph touched it gently to Isaiah's lips, and then came the words, See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away. Your sin is atoned for. No lecture, no condemnation, just mercy, healing, transformation. What happened in that moment wasn't just symbolic. It was spiritual surgery. Isaiah didn't just feel forgiven. He was forgiven, cleansed, commissioned. The smoke began to clear. The trembling settled. And then another voice filled the space. Not from a seraph. This time it was God himself. Whom shall I send? And who will go for us? Isaiah didn't hesitate. He didn't pause to check if he was qualified. He didn't ask what the job was. He simply said, Here am I. Send me. And just like that, his mission began. But here's the thing. This wasn't just about one man in one moment. Isaiah's story is bigger than that, because what he experienced in the temple speaks to something we all face: that sense of being unworthy, that question of whether we can really make a difference, that need to be made whole before we can be sent out into the world with purpose. Isaiah's vision is a powerful reminder that true transformation begins when we come face to face with something or someone greater than ourselves. And when we do, it changes everything. The coal touching his lips wasn't just about forgiveness, it was about preparation. Because Isaiah wasn't just being cleansed, he was being equipped to carry a message that would shake kings, confront corruption, and offer hope in the darkest of times. It's easy to miss how radical that is. In a world where status and speech and surface appearance mean everything, here's a man saying, "I'm not clean, I'm not ready, I'm broken." And God says, "Perfect. You're exactly who I'm looking for." That's the paradox of calling. It starts in humility. It starts when you stop pretending to be more than you are and simply say, "I'm here. Use me." What Isaiah saw that day, the vision, the glory, the coal, the call, it wasn't just a mystical experience for his own benefit. It was the beginning of a life that would echo across centuries. He would go on to speak to rulers. He would denounce injustice. He would foretell a coming kingdom of peace and righteousness. But none of that could happen until this moment in the temple, when a young man, overwhelmed by his own flaws, was touched by grace and launched into a mission that would change the world. So if you're wondering whether your past disqualifies you, if you're questioning whether your flaws are too great, if you're waiting for a sign that your life has meaning, this is it. Because, just like Isaiah, your greatest transformation could begin in the very moment you feel most unworthy. So Isaiah said, "Here am I, send me." And God said, "Go." But what came next wasn't the triumphant mission many would expect. There was no promise of admiration, no guarantee of success. In fact, the first words of Isaiah's divine assignment were, let's be honest, absolutely crushing. God said, "Go and tell this people, be ever hearing but never understanding. Be ever seeing but never perceiving." Wait, what? Isaiah had just had the most powerful encounter of his life. He was cleansed, called, and willing. And now the mission was to speak to a people who wouldn't listen. Exactly. God made it clear. The nation of Israel was too far gone. Corruption ran deep. Their hearts had grown hard. Their ears were closed. Their eyes refused to see. Isaiah's job wasn't to be celebrated or embraced. It was to speak the truth, even if it broke his heart. And let's be real, that had to hit hard. Imagine standing in the ruins of a once great society, being told to deliver a message that would fall on deaf ears, to warn people who wouldn't change, to love a nation that might never love you back. Isaiah asked, "For how long, Lord?" And God's reply wasn't easy to hear. "Until the cities lie ruined, until the land is utterly forsaken. And even then, a stump will remain." That was the reality of Isaiah's mission. He would be a prophet not of applause, but of warning, not of comfort, but of confrontation. But that didn't stop him. Isaiah began to speak loudly, boldly, prophetically. He thundered through the streets of Jerusalem. Woe to the sinful nation, a people loaded with guilt, a brood of evildoers, children given to corruption. This wasn't a vague sermon. He named names. He pointed fingers. He exposed the rot in society: priests who performed empty rituals, judges who took bribes, leaders who crushed the poor. Isaiah wasn't playing it safe. He wasn't trying to be liked. He was doing exactly what he was called to do. And what's wild is this: despite all the judgment, all the fire and brimstone, Isaiah didn't stop at condemnation. He always left a window open for grace. "Come now," he said, "let us reason together. Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be as white as snow." That's the thing with Isaiah. He saw the darkness, but he never lost sight of the light. He spoke judgment, but he also spoke hope. He could look at a nation neck deep in injustice and still say, "There's a way back. You can return. You can be healed." Isaiah's mission wasn't easy. It was lonely, often painful, and sometimes met with outright hostility. But it was honest, it was faithful, and it was powerful. As he continued to speak, Isaiah became a lightning rod. Some people feared him, others mocked him. The elite tried to silence him, but his voice only grew louder. When King Ahaz started making political deals that contradicted God's guidance, Isaiah showed up. Not with swords, but with truth. Ahaz wanted to ally with Assyria. He saw power and safety there. But Isaiah warned him, "If you do not stand firm in your faith, you will not stand at all." Still, Ahaz didn't listen. Isaiah offered him a sign from God, a miracle, a direct confirmation. But Ahaz refused. "I won't test the Lord," he said. Sounds humble, right? But it wasn't. It was pride dressed in piety. He didn't want God's sign because he had already made up his mind. Isaiah saw through it, and he fired back with one of the most famous prophecies ever recorded. "The Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel, God with us." That phrase would echo for generations. It wasn't just about Ahaz. It was about something bigger, something global, something eternal. But in that moment, Isaiah stood there heartbroken because the king didn't listen. The people didn't listen. The nation kept slipping deeper into rebellion. Still, Isaiah kept going. He called out false prophets, those who said everything was fine when it wasn't. He denounced priests who turned worship into performance. He warned kings that power meant nothing if it wasn't rooted in justice. And the people? Some listened. Most didn't. But Isaiah wasn't in it for applause. He was in it for truth. He reminded the people of what God actually wanted. Not empty rituals or impressive ceremonies, but justice, compassion, integrity. "Learn to do right," he cried. "Seek justice. Defend the oppressed. Take up the cause of the fatherless. Plead the case of the widow." These weren't suggestions. They were calls to action. But even as he laid down heavy judgment, Isaiah also painted pictures of hope, visions of a better world. He saw beyond the corruption and despair to something beautiful on the horizon. One of his most powerful declarations: "Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be white as snow." It's that tension. Again, truth and grace, judgment and mercy. That was Isaiah's signature. Because he didn't just see he saw what could be. He saw a nation that had lost its way. Yes, but also a God who hadn't given up on them. And that gave him the strength to keep going. He knew his job wasn't to fix everything overnight. It was to speak, to shine, to be faithful. And maybe, just maybe, his words would spark a change. Maybe one heart. Maybe one home. Maybe one generation would wake up, turn around, and walk back toward the light. Isaiah's mission reminds us of something deeply important. Obedience doesn't always look like success. Sometimes it looks like speaking truth to power. Sometimes it looks like being misunderstood. Sometimes it means showing up again and again, even when no one seems to care. But the impact, the legacy, it can last for generations. Isaiah was more than a prophet. He was a voice, a mirror, a flame. And even when the people didn't listen, he kept burning bright. Isaiah's mission wasn't just prophetic, it was political. Not in the way of campaigning or taking sides, but in the sense that his words directly challenged kings' policies and the direction of an entire nation. His voice echoed in the corridors of palaces and temples, calling out injustices and urging leaders to turn back to God. When Isaiah confronted King Ahaz, it wasn't just a personal encounter. It was a flashpoint between faith and fear, between trusting in God and making dangerous compromises. Ahaz had been terrified. The northern kingdom of Israel, allied with Syria, had threatened Jerusalem. In panic, Ahaz considered reaching out to Assyria for help, a move Isaiah strongly opposed. Isaiah didn't just plead, he warned. He offered a sign, Emmanuel, a child born of a virgin, a child whose very name meant God with us. But Ahaz, caught up in his political chess game, brushed off the offer. And that set the tone for what would follow. Because Isaiah's role wasn't to deliver good news to eager ears. It was to confront, to warn, and to plant seeds of truth in soil that seemed too dry to grow anything. Later, when King Hezekiah came to power, a more faithful king, but still a flawed man, Isaiah was again at the center of critical moments in Judah's history. The kingdom was still under threat. Assyria was rising, swallowing nations like a tidal wave. And soon, it came for Jerusalem. The Assyrian army surrounded the city. Their commander mocked Judah's faith, ridiculed Hezekiah's trust in God, and taunted the people with messages of inevitable defeat. And then Isaiah stepped in. He didn't rally an army. He didn't shout from the walls. He spoke a simple, stunning promise. Do not be afraid, because the Lord would defend the city, not by sword, not by alliance, but by his own hand. And just like that, the tide turned. The Assyrian army, poised to strike, was devastated by a mysterious event. Some say a plague, others an angelic intervention. But whatever it was, Isaiah's prophecy came true. Jerusalem was spared. That moment boosted Isaiah's credibility. People saw him not just as a loud voice or a moral critic, but as someone who heard from God and could be trusted when everything was on the line. But even then, Isaiah wasn't finished. He continued to speak into the nation's spiritual life, sometimes boldly, sometimes poetically. His messages weren't just about judgment. They were filled with powerful metaphors, symbols, and visions of what could be if the people turned back to their Creator. And one of the most enduring themes that began to emerge was this, the promise of a Messiah. Isaiah spoke of a future king, not just another Davidic descendant, but the one, the chosen, the anointed. He described him not as a warrior or political conqueror, but as something unexpected, a servant, a man of sorrows, despised and rejected, wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. The prophecy didn't make sense at the time. A suffering servant, a king who would bear guilt. It sounded more like tragedy than triumph, but Isaiah kept repeating it, layering it with images and details. A virgin birth, a prince of peace, a righteous branch from the stump of Jesse, a light shining in the darkness. And though his audience might not have understood, Isaiah was painting a masterpiece, one brushstroke at a time, of a hope that would one day change the world. It's hard to overstate the courage it took to say these things in his day, because even as he spoke of a glorious future, Isaiah remained in the middle of political decay and spiritual apathy. Corruption hadn't gone away. Leaders still turned to foreign gods. The rich still trampled the poor. And often, Isaiah was still seen as more of a nuisance than a prophet. But he didn't stop. In fact, he went further. He began to act out his messages. At one point, God told Isaiah to walk barefoot and nearly naked for 3 years, an enacted prophecy warning of coming judgment on Egypt and Cush nations Israel wrongly trusted for security. Imagine the shock, the confusion, the mockery. But Isaiah obeyed, and it worked. People couldn't ignore him anymore. They asked questions. They paid attention. That's what Isaiah was willing to do. Risk his reputation, his safety, even his dignity to drive the message home. And perhaps one of the most touching parts of his ministry was this: Isaiah wasn't just a mouthpiece. He was a father. He named his sons with meaning. One son's name meant a remnant shall return. Another's name meant quick to the plunder, swift to the spoil. His own children became living symbols, reminders to everyone around him of what was coming. And in that, we see something deeply human. Isaiah wasn't removed from the message. He lived it. His home, his body, his heart. All of it was on the altar of obedience. But obedience came at a cost. Tradition holds that Isaiah may have died under the reign of King Manasseh, possibly sawn in two for his faith. Whether or not that detail is historically confirmed, it reflects a brutal reality. Speaking truth to power can get you killed. And yet Isaiah never recanted, never softened, never gave in, because his anchor was that first vision. The throne, the smoke, the seraphim, the coal. He had seen the Lord. And once you've seen that, no threat from man can make you back down. His life, his message, his sacrifice, they weren't just for his generation. They were for ours. Because Isaiah reminds us that even in the darkest times, you can still be a light, even when no one listens. Your words still matter, even when kings ignore you. The King of Kings is watching, and even when hope seems foolish, it might just be the truest thing you can speak. Isaiah was more than a prophet. He was a bridge between the broken present and the glorious future. And his voice still calls out across the centuries, asking us to see, to listen, to believe. Amid all the chaos, the kings, the corruption, and the cries for repentance, Isaiah's message never stopped evolving. And one of the most extraordinary shifts came when he began to speak not just about what was happening now, but what was still to come, far beyond his own time. Isaiah started to unveil a series of breathtaking visions, glimpses of a future so unlike the present it could barely be imagined. It all started with a mountain, but not just any mountain. The mountain of the Lord's temple, Isaiah said, will be established as the highest of the mountains, and all nations will stream to it. It wasn't just geography. This mountain symbolized a new spiritual center of gravity, a place where people wouldn't come to conquer, but to learn, to seek, to be changed. Come, they would say to one another, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, that he may teach us his ways and we may walk in his paths. Think about that. A world where instead of war, nations pursue wisdom. Instead of clashing swords, people chase truth. And then Isaiah says something even more wild. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Weapons turned into farming tools, instruments of death transformed into tools for life. It wasn't just a poetic line. It was a radical declaration. War would end. Peace would reign. Not because people grew tired of fighting, but because they encountered something more powerful than conflict, the presence of the divine. And leading this new world order, not a general, not a politician, but a child. Yes, a child. Isaiah's vision zooms in. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit. He was talking about a descendant of King David, a leader like no other. and the Spirit of the Lord would rest upon him not in part, but in fullness. Wisdom, understanding, counsel, might, knowledge, and reverence. This leader wouldn't judge by appearances. He wouldn't play favorites. He would rule with true justice. He would protect the poor, defend the meek, strike the oppressor, not with weapons, but with the truth of his words. And the result? A total transformation of reality. Isaiah paints a picture so beautiful it's almost surreal. The wolf will live with the lamb. The leopard will lie down with the goat. The calf and the lion and the yearling together. And a little child will lead them. It's not just about animals. It's about nature itself being rewired. Harmony replacing hostility. Safety replacing fear. Even the most vulnerable, a child, would be able to lead what used to be predators. And then this line may be the most powerful of all. The earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Not just belief, knowledge. Deep, intimate, unshakable awareness of God. This wasn't about rituals anymore, or national borders, or temporary reforms. This was about a total renewal. Isaiah kept pushing this idea forward, deeper, broader. He spoke of a time when every valley would be raised up, every mountain made low, and crooked places made straight. A highway for our God cutting through the chaos and making a way for everyone to return to him. And in this renewed world, even creation would rejoice. The desert and the parched land will be glad. The wilderness will rejoice and blossom. Imagine that flowers in the desert, life bursting out of lifeless places. That's the kind of restoration Isaiah was seeing. Not just spiritual, not just social, cosmic. He was describing a world made whole again, not through conquest, not through ideology, but through the reign of a righteous king. And he didn't stop there. Isaiah spoke of healing, of inclusion, of a time when the blind would see, the deaf would hear, and the lame would leap like deer. A time when no one would be excluded because of weakness, poverty, or status. When all would be welcomed to the table of God. My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, he said. For all nations. That's a massive shift. In a world divided by tribe, by language, by empire, Isaiah was saying God's invitation is going global, and his kingdom will be a kingdom of unity. Jerusalem, once besieged and broken, would become a beacon. Arise, shine, for your light has come, he declared, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you. Nations would come to its light, kings to the brightness of its dawn. This wasn't just prophecy. It was poetry, infused with divine power. And then came one of the most challenging, humbling parts of Isaiah's message. The future king, the one anointed by God, would suffer. He would be rejected. He would be pierced. He would be crushed, not for his own wrongdoing, but for ours. He was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. A servant king, a suffering savior, a redeemer who would carry the weight of a broken world. That vision would later resonate through history in ways Isaiah couldn't have imagined. But at the time, it must have sounded like a paradox. How could glory come through pain? How could triumph be born out of sacrifice? And yet that was the core of Isaiah's message. That real peace, real justice, and real restoration wouldn't come through force, but through self-giving love. He saw a future where every tear would be wiped away, where people would sit under their own vines and fig trees without fear, where joy would replace weeping, and songs of praise would rise in place of cries of sorrow. Isaiah was laying out not just a roadmap for Judah, but a blueprint for humanity, a world where righteousness and peace kiss, where justice and mercy hold hands, where the knowledge of God isn't reserved for the elite, but pours into every street, every home, every heart. And the amazing part, this wasn't just wishful thinking. It was a promise, backed by the one who sits on the throne. Isaiah saw all those years ago. And that promise still echoes. It invites us to look beyond the chaos of today, to dare to believe in something better, to live now in a way that points toward that future. Because Isaiah's visions weren't just for ancient kings and distant generations. They're for us, here, now, if we're willing to listen. As Isaiah's message continued, it moved through judgment, through vision, through hardship, and into something just as profound: restoration. Because yes, the people of Judah would fall. The city of Jerusalem would one day lie in ruins. The temple would be torn down. Exile would come like a storm, sweeping across everything sacred. But even in the midst of all that devastation, Isaiah offered something rare: hope, and not just vague optimism, not a pat on the back or a wishful thought. Isaiah delivered a divine promise of total sweeping restoration, personal, national, even cosmic. Comfort, comfort, my people, begins one of Isaiah's most tender oracles. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem, that her sin has been paid for. After all the harsh words, after the judgments and warnings, now came mercy, now came healing. Isaiah painted images of valleys being lifted up, mountains being made low, and a clear, straight highway appearing in the desert, a path leading straight home. But it wasn't just a road back to the land. It was a road back to God. Isaiah envisioned a new Jerusalem, not just rebuilt, but reborn. A city that once stood as a symbol of rebellion and idolatry would become a beacon of holiness, shining with divine glory. Arise, shine, he declared, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you. No longer desolate, no longer defeated. Jerusalem would become a magnet for the nations, a light to the world, the place where God's presence would dwell openly and powerfully. But restoration wasn't limited to buildings or borders. Isaiah saw something deeper: a new relationship between God and his people. This time, it wouldn't be based on tablets of stone or ceremonial law. Instead, God would write his will directly on their hearts. Obedience wouldn't be enforced from the outside. It would flow from within. This was the heart of a new covenant. And in this renewed relationship, Isaiah saw radical healing. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, he wrote, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners. That passage, so full of compassion, so charged with mission, would later be read aloud by another man centuries later in a synagogue in Nazareth. That man would say, "Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." But back in Isaiah's day, it was a bold declaration, a divine pledge that the hurting, the forgotten, the oppressed, they mattered. And their healing wasn't just possible, it was promised. Isaiah saw a future where the blind would see, the deaf would hear, and the lame would leap like deer, where the wilderness would blossom and the deserts would burst into bloom. He spoke of joy returning to the streets, of mourning turning into dancing, of garments of praise replacing spirits of despair. It wasn't a band-aid over brokenness. It was deep systemic restoration, a renewal that touched every corner of life. And perhaps, most moving of all, Isaiah didn't just see healing for Judah. He saw healing for everyone. My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, God declared through Isaiah. That meant outsiders would be welcomed in. The formerly excluded, the foreigner, the eunuch, the outcast, they would find a home, a name, and a purpose in God's kingdom. The dividing lines would fall. What once kept people apart would be erased. This restoration would be wide enough for the world. And in the midst of this future, Isaiah introduced a mysterious figure, the servant of the Lord. Unlike any previous prophet, priest, or king, this servant would be uniquely anointed, chosen, obedient, but also rejected. He would suffer, be silenced, be disfigured, and yet his suffering wouldn't be pointless. He was pierced for our transgressions, Isaiah wrote. He was crushed for our iniquities, and by his wounds we are healed. This servant would take on the burden of sin, not his own, but ours. And somehow, in that suffering, redemption would rise. This wasn't just another chapter in Isaiah's scroll. It was the heartbeat, because through this servant everything would change. Injustice would be answered, sin would be dealt with, and restoration, true lasting restoration, would begin. Even Isaiah may not have fully grasped what he was writing. The words were so heavy, so layered, so filled with mystery, but generations would return to them again and again, looking for hope, looking for clarity, looking for the one who would fulfill these words. And as Isaiah kept speaking, his vision grew even bigger. He saw a new heaven, a new earth, not just spiritual metaphors, but a literal recreation, a world made whole, a universe redeemed. No more will babies live only a few days, he said. No more will people build homes and others live in them, or plant and not eat the fruit. He described a time of peace, abundance, and deep joy, a time when people would live long lives, when pain would vanish, when even the wolf and the lamb would graze together in peace. This was the future Isaiah saw, not fantasy, not escape, but the destination of a divine promise. Isaiah's vision of restoration wasn't a wish, it was a roadmap, a revelation. And it wasn't just for Judah in exile. It was for all of us walking through the brokenness of our own worlds, yearning for something more. Because Isaiah knew ruin doesn't have to be the end. God rebuilds, God restores, and God always keeps his promises. One of Isaiah's most defining moments came during a time of deep political and spiritual crisis. King Ahaz, ruling over Judah, stood on the brink of collapse. The northern kingdom of Israel had teamed up with Syria to attack Jerusalem. The plan? Remove Ahaz from the throne and replace him with a puppet ruler. It was a terrifying moment. National security, royal lineage, and the survival of the nation all hung in the balance. Ahaz panicked, and when fear takes over, faith often disappears. Instead of trusting God, Ahaz looked eastward for help from Assyria, a brutal empire with an appetite for conquest. Isaiah, faithful as always, stepped forward with a message from God. He met Ahaz at a seemingly ordinary place, the end of the aqueduct near the washer's field. But what happened there was anything but ordinary. Isaiah looked the king in the eye and said, "Be careful, keep calm, don't be afraid." He assured him that the plan of Israel and Syria would not succeed. God had already written their end. But Isaiah didn't stop there. He did something that's still stunning. Centuries later, he told Ahaz to ask God for a sign. "Ask for anything," Isaiah said. "Let it be as deep as the grave or as high as the heavens." It was an invitation, a divine guarantee that God was ready to prove his promise. But Ahaz refused. "I will not ask. I will not put the Lord to the test," he said. Sounds righteous, right? But Isaiah wasn't fooled. This wasn't humility. It was hidden unbelief. Ahaz had already made up his mind. He wanted Assyria, not the Almighty. And Isaiah responded with both frustration and revelation. "Is it not enough to try the patience of humans?" he said. "Will you now try the patience of my God also?" And then came the prophecy that would echo across generations. "The Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel." Emmanuel, God with us. At the time, it meant that Judah would be preserved, that the house of David, though trembling, would not fall, that despite Ahaz's unbelief, God was still faithful. But Isaiah's words reached far beyond Ahaz. They pointed to something bigger, something eternal. Because centuries later, when a young virgin named Mary gave birth to a child in Bethlehem, Isaiah's words would come alive again. Emmanuel wasn't just a name. It was a declaration that God was stepping into human history, not as smoke or thunder or vision, but in flesh and blood. The sign of Emmanuel bridged two worlds, the divine and the human. It told us that God doesn't remain distant. He enters into our mess, our crisis, our fear, even when we make the wrong choices like Ahaz, even when we cling to the wrong solutions, like trusting Assyria instead of the Almighty. God comes anyway. That's the heart of Isaiah's message. Not just judgment for rebellion, but mercy for those who stray. Not just a throne high and lifted up, but a cradle in a manger. That kind of paradox is everywhere in Isaiah's writing. A king who serves, a servant who saves, a child who conquers. It's all woven through Isaiah's visions, pieces of a puzzle that would one day come together in the life of Jesus. Isaiah didn't know the name Jesus, but he knew the shape of the story. He knew what it would take to heal the world. And even as he delivered messages of discipline and doom, Isaiah always held fast to hope. He knew that judgment wasn't the end. God wasn't finished. And that's where Isaiah's prophecies stretch out even further. He didn't just talk about Emmanuel or a suffering servant. He also saw a righteous king, a ruler who would reign with justice and bring peace without end. A child is born. A son is given. And the government will be on his shoulders. He will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, his reign eternal, his justice perfect, his peace unshakable. This wasn't wishful thinking. It was divine revelation. Isaiah saw not just what was, but what would be. And through his words, generations caught a glimpse of something worth waiting for, worth believing in, worth living toward. A kingdom without corruption, a people restored, a creation healed, and a God who walks with us. In the darkest times, Isaiah's words were a lantern, a reminder that God had not abandoned his people even when they abandoned him. And that same lantern still burns today, because the truth is, we all have an Ahaz moment, a crisis where we have to choose between faith and fear, between divine trust and human schemes, between waiting on God and rushing toward convenience. And in those moments, Isaiah's voice rises once again. He calls us to listen, to trust, to believe that the promise of Emmanuel still stands. God is still with us, even when we don't feel it, even when we're overwhelmed, even when our faith falters. Isaiah reminds us that God's faithfulness is not based on our performance. It's based on his character, and that character is constant, merciful, powerful, present. Isaiah's prophecy of Emmanuel didn't just offer comfort to a wavering king, it offered hope to the entire world. Because in that one name, God with us, lies the greatest truth of all. We are not alone. As the chapters of Isaiah's life unfolded, what remained clear was that his calling wasn't temporary. His voice didn't fade with the passing of kings or the crumbling of cities. If anything, Isaiah became louder across time, his words more vital, more stirring, more urgent with every new generation that discovered them. Because Isaiah didn't just speak to the people of Judah, he spoke to us, to anyone who has ever felt abandoned, to anyone who has wondered if justice would ever win, to anyone who has looked around and seen chaos, suffering, and despair, and silently asked, "Where is God in all of this?" Isaiah answers that question over and over again. God is here. God is with us. And God is not done, even after exile, even after rebellion, even after all the wrong choices and shattered dreams. The book of Isaiah closes with a powerful crescendo, a vision not just of survival, but of celebration, not just of forgiveness, but of transformation. He speaks of a new heaven and a new earth, not a recycled version of what came before, not just a cleanup job, but something radically new. A world where former things will not be remembered, where sorrow is a distant memory, where joy and peace are the natural state of things, where people live out their days in safety, dignity, and abundance. Isaiah's final visions are filled with poetry that touches the deepest parts of the soul. They will build houses and dwell in them. They will plant vineyards and eat their fruit. They will not labor in vain or bear children doomed to misfortune. Can you imagine that? A world where effort isn't wasted, where families thrive, where pain doesn't set the tone for every day. That's the world Isaiah saw. And at the heart of it all was a promise. The Lord will rejoice over you. It's easy to think of God as distant, cold, busy. But Isaiah describes a God who dances with joy over his people, a God who rebuilds what's broken, a God who remembers the forgotten, a God who keeps showing up even when we've stopped believing. And here's what makes Isaiah's legacy so profound. He didn't just talk about these things. He lived them. He gave everything to speak the truth. His comfort, his reputation, maybe even his life. Jewish tradition suggests Isaiah was martyred possibly under King Manasseh, a ruler known for his wickedness. Though we can't confirm the exact details, the legend underscores something we do know. Being a prophet, a real one, was never safe. It was costly. Isaiah didn't deliver messages people wanted to hear. He delivered what they needed to hear. He stood in the gap. He cried out when others were silent. He called people back when they wanted to run away. And through it all, he never lost hope. That might be the most remarkable thing of all. Even when he saw judgment coming, even when leaders rejected him, even when exile became inevitable, Isaiah still spoke of healing, of peace, of a coming king, of a world reborn. That's what set him apart. He was relentless in his conviction, but also relentless in his compassion. He could expose sin one moment and offer comfort the next. He didn't speak at the people. He spoke for them. He didn't remove himself from the pain. He carried it. Isaiah's intercessory prayers revealed just how deeply he identified with his people. He pleaded with God, not as a distant observer, but as someone in the thick of it. Lord, he cried, have mercy. We are your people. And when words weren't enough, he acted. He named his sons with prophetic meaning. He walked barefoot as a living sermon. He allowed his life to become a canvas for God's message. And here's the truth. That's what a prophet really is. Not just a predictor of the future, not just a moralizer, but someone who embodies the word, who lets it run through their bones, who loves deeply, speaks boldly, and never lets the truth be silenced. That was Isaiah. And because of him, we have some of the richest, deepest, most powerful passages in all of Scripture. Words that shaped not only Judaism, but the very foundation of Christianity. His vision of a suffering servant would become central to the Christian understanding of Jesus. His declaration of Emmanuel would be echoed in Christmas sermons and whispered in hospital rooms. His poetry of peace would inspire civil rights leaders and everyday dreamers alike. And even today, when the world feels heavy and uncertain, Isaiah's words remind us of what's possible. That swords can become plowshares, that deserts can bloom, that broken people can be made whole, that God is still writing the story, and the best chapters are yet to come. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a choice. We can be like the people of Judah, stiff-necked, hardened, deaf to the voice of truth. Or we can be like Isaiah, flawed, yes, but willing to see, willing to speak, willing to say, here I am, send me. Isaiah didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to be available. And so do we. So the challenge stands. Will you let Isaiah's words live in you? Will you be a voice of hope, a messenger of truth, a light in dark places? Because if you do, you're not alone. You're part of something bigger, a legacy that spans millennia, a mission that still matters, a kingdom that's still coming. So let Isaiah's vision guide your steps. Let his fire ignite your heart. And let his God, our God, be the one who speaks through your life. The journey doesn't end here. It begins now. Let's walk it together.